The dust cloud on the horizon was the first sign of trouble that Tess Newbury had ever failed to heed. It was the summer of 1876, and the golden Nebraska plains that had once promised so much now seemed to mock her with their endless emptiness. She stood on the porch of her small farmhouse, watching as the riders approached, her heart growing heavier with each passing moment. They weren't coming to offer help, not this time. Tess wiped her hands on her faded calico dress, tucking a wayward strand of auburn hair behind her ear. 23 years of life had taught her to be cautious, but the past year had taught her about true loss. First her father to consumption, then her mother to grief. Now she stood alone on land that had been in her family for only 3 short years. The men rode up, 5 of them, with cold eyes that had seen too much and souls that had forgotten mercy. At their lead was Edward Holloway, the banker from Verdi. His thin lips stretched into what might have been mistaken for a smile by those who didn't know better. "Miss Newbury," he said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy, "I believe you know why we're here." "Mr. Holloway," Tess acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've asked for more time." "And you've had it," Holloway replied, dismounting his horse with a groan that spoke of aging joints and diminishing patience. 3 months more than what was agreed upon. The bank can't extend any further leniency. Tess stood her ground as the men spread out, entering her home without permission. She heard them inside, rummaging through the few possessions she had left. Her father's pocket watch, her mother's silver hairbrush, the family Bible with generations of names inscribed within its pages. "You can't take everything," she said, her voice rising. The law, Holloway interrupted, states that when a debt isn't paid, collateral is seized. Your father borrowed against this land and everything on it. Now it belongs to the bank." He produced papers from his vest pocket, waving them as if they were holy writ. "Everything here is being seized to cover what's owed." The men emerged from the house carrying her belongings, loading them onto a wagon that had followed behind. One of them, a man with a scar running down his cheek, walked past with her mother's china teapot, the one thing Tess had promised herself she would save. "Not that," she said, reaching for it. "Please, not that." The man jerked it away, and the delicate handle snapped, falling to the ground and shattering. He shrugged, tossing the damaged teapot onto the wagon with careless indifference. Tess watched as they emptied her home, taking furniture that her father had built, quilts her mother had stitched through long winter nights, and tools that had broken the prairie soil. She stood silent, dignity her only remaining possession. "You have until sundown to vacate the property," Holloway said, mounting his horse. "The new owners take possession tomorrow." As they rode away, Tess entered the barren house that no longer felt like home. Empty spaces where furniture had stood, bare walls where family portraits had hung. She sank to the floor, allowing herself tears for the first time since her mother's passing. Night fell as Tess gathered what little remained: a change of clothes, her father's old hunting knife, a handful of coins hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and a locket containing a snippet of her mother's hair. She wrapped these meager treasures in a shawl and stepped out into the darkness, uncertain where to go, but knowing she couldn't stay. The road to Verdi stretched before her, moonlight illuminating the path. It was 12 miles to town, a journey she could make by morning if she kept a steady pace. Perhaps Mrs. Jensen at the boarding house would give her work. Perhaps the general store needed help. Perhaps... A rustling sound from the tall grass beside the road made her freeze. Tess clutched her father's knife, drawing it from her bundle with trembling hands. "Who's there?" she called, trying to sound braver than she felt. A figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, leading a horse. In the moonlight, she could make out the silhouette of a cowboy hat and the glint of what might have been a star on his chest. "Madam," the man said, his voice deep and measured, "it's not safe for a woman to be walking these roads alone at night." "I don't have much choice," Tess replied, not lowering her knife. He stepped closer, and she could see him better now. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps no more than 30. His eyes were kind beneath the brim of his hat, though there was a weariness to them that spoke of hardships endured. "Name's Thomas Callahan," he said, keeping his distance out of respect for the knife in her hand. "Deputy Marshal out of Verdi." "Tess Newbury," she responded, still wary. "I'm heading to town." "Looking for work." The deputy nodded, taking in her small bundle and the empty house behind her. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Holloway's men? Tess nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They took everything I had, she whispered, the words catching on a sob she couldn't quite suppress. The deputy was silent for a moment, studying her with eyes that seemed to see more than just her current state. Then, with quiet conviction, he spoke. Not everything, the cowboy said. You still have tomorrow. Something in his voice that's confidence without condescension. Hope without hollow promises made Tess believe him, at least enough to lower her knife. Allow me to escort you to town, he offered, gesturing to his horse. You can ride, I'll walk alongside. Tess hesitated. Her parents had taught her to be cautious of strangers, even those wearing a badge. But there was something about Thomas Callahan that inspired trust. Why would you help me? She asked. Because it's right, he answered simply. And because I've seen what Holloway and his kind do to good people. I may be sworn to uphold the law, but that doesn't mean I have to like how some men twist it. After a moment's consideration, Tess accepted his offer, allowing him to help her mount his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty. They set off toward Verde, the deputy walking steadily beside the horse, occasionally pointing out landmarks in the darkness, or sharing bits of information about the town. Mrs. Jensen's boarding house is full up, he told her, but my sister Abigail runs a millinery shop in town. She's been looking for help, someone with a good eye and steady hands. I can sew, Tess said, hope flickering to life, despite her best efforts to temper it. My mother taught me. I made all our clothes. Thomas nodded approvingly. Then you and Abby will get along just fine. As they traveled, Tess found herself sharing the story of her family's journey from Pennsylvania to Nebraska, lured by promises of land and opportunity. How her father had taken out a loan to purchase seed and equipment when their first harvest failed. How his illness had drained their savings. How the bank had refused her pleas for more time after his death. It's not right, Thomas said, his jaw tightening. Holloway has been doing this all over the county, lending to farmers when times are hard, then foreclosing as soon as they can't make a payment. The land always seems to end up in the hands of the same few men. By the time they reached Verde, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. The small town was just beginning to stir, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, the blacksmith lighting his forge. Thomas led Tess to a modest two-story building, with a sign reading, Callahan Millinery, hanging above the door. Abby lives upstairs, he explained, tethering his horse to a hitching post. Shop's on the main floor. He knocked, and moments later, a woman with the same kind eyes as Thomas opened the door. Her hair was the color of wheat, pulled back in a practical bun, and her smile was warm as she greeted her brother. Thomas, what brings you here so early? Her gaze shifted to Tess, curiosity replacing surprise. Abby, this is Miss Tess Newbury. She's in need of work and lodging. Thought you might be able to help. Abigail's expression softened as she took in Tess's disheveled appearance and small bundle of possessions. Without hesitation, she opened the door wider. Come in, dear. You look like you could use some breakfast and a cup of coffee. Tess followed Abigail into a cozy kitchen behind the shop, while Thomas excused himself to report for duty. Over eggs and biscuits, Tess shared her story again, this time receiving Abigail's sympathetic nods and occasional outbursts of indignation. Holloway's a snake, Abigail declared, pouring more coffee. He's ruined half the families in this county with his schemes. By the end of breakfast, Abigail had offered Tess not only a job in the shop, but also the small spare room upstairs. The wage wasn't much, but it included room and board, and Tess could start immediately. Your brother said you needed someone with steady hands, Tess said, grateful beyond words. Abigail smiled. I do, but I would have offered anyway. This town was built on neighbors helping neighbors. Seems to me that's something Holloway and his ilk have forgotten. That afternoon, Tess began work in the millinery shop, learning to create and trim ladies' hats for the women of Verde and surrounding farms. Her nimble fingers, accustomed to fine needlework, quickly adapted to working with ribbons, feathers, and delicate fabrics. Abigail was a patient teacher, and Tess found comfort in the rhythmic work and friendly atmosphere of the shop. Days passed, then weeks. Tess settled into her new life in Verde, Nebraska, gradually getting to know the townspeople. She attended church on Sundays, joined the ladies' sewing circle, and even began helping with the town's small lending library, which operated out of a corner of the general store. Through it all, she occasionally caught glimpses of Thomas Callahan making his rounds, keeping order in the small but growing community. One evening in late August, as Tess was closing the shop, Thomas appeared at the door, hat in hand. "Miss Newbury," he said, a touch of nervousness in his usually confident voice. "I wonder if you might join me for supper at the hotel restaurant tonight. There's a matter I'd like to discuss with you." Curious and somewhat apprehensive, Tess agreed, changing from her work dress into her one good outfit, a blue calico dress that Abigail had helped her make from shop scraps. When she came downstairs, Thomas was waiting, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt beneath his usual vest. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Verdi, with white tablecloths and actual glassware instead of tin cups. Tess felt out of place until Thomas led her to a quiet table in the corner, pulling out her chair with a courtly gesture that made her smile despite her nervousness. After they had ordered beef stew and fresh bread, Thomas cleared his throat. "Miss Newbury, Tess, I've been looking into your situation with the bank." Tess's heart sank. She had been trying not to think about her lost home, focusing instead on building a new life. "I appreciate your concern, Deputy Callahan, but—" "Thomas," he interrupted gently. "Please call me Thomas." Tess nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Thomas. But there's nothing to be done. The bank had legal right to take everything." "That's just it," Thomas said, leaning forward. "I'm not sure they did. I've been reviewing the county records and something doesn't add up. Your father's loan should have had a 3-year term, with payments due quarterly, but Holloway called it due after just 18 months. Hope and anger warred in Tess's heart. "Are you saying he broke the law?" "I'm saying there's a possibility the foreclosure wasn't legal, but I need more information." Thomas hesitated. "Did your father keep any papers, any documents related to the loan?" Tess shook her head, then paused. "Wait, there was a tin box. He kept important papers in it, hidden in the barn beneath a loose floorboard. I don't know if it's still there. They took everything else." "Not everything," Thomas reminded her, a determined glint in his eye. "If those papers are still there, they might be the key to getting your land back." After supper, they made plans. Thomas would ride out to the farm the next evening to search for the documents. Tess insisted on accompanying him, despite his concerns for her safety. "It was my home," she said firmly. "I should be there." The following night, they rode double on Thomas's horse, leaving town after dusk to avoid unwanted attention. The journey was made in companionable silence, broken only by necessary communication. Tess was acutely aware of Thomas's solid presence behind her, his arms reaching around to hold the reins, keeping her secure in the saddle. As they approached the farm, now dark and abandoned, a wave of emotion washed over Tess. It had been her home for such a short time. Yet seeing it neglected, with weeds already beginning to reclaim the yard, felt like losing it all over again. They tethered the horse at a safe distance and approached on the foot, moving quietly through the tall grass. The house stood empty, windows like vacant eyes staring out across the plains. But it was the barn they were interested in. The door creaked as Thomas pushed it open, and Tess winced at the sound. Inside, the space was largely empty. Farm equipment had been taken, along with the wagon and plow. Only a few broken tools and piles of old hay remained. "Where was the hiding place?" Thomas whispered, striking a match to light the lantern he'd brought. Tess led him to the back corner, near where her father had kept his workbench. "Here, under this plank." Together they knelt, and Thomas used his knife to pry up the weathered wood. Beneath it was a small cavity, and within that cavity, miraculously overlooked by Holloway's men, sat a rusted tin box. Tess's hands trembled as she lifted it out, brushing away dirt and cobwebs. The simple metal container represented her last connection to her father, to the life they had tried to build here. "Let's take it back to town," Thomas suggested. "It's not safe to linger." They had just secured the box in Thomas's saddlebag when a noise outside the barn made them freeze. The sound of horses approaching, men's voices carrying through the night air. "Quick," Thomas whispered, extinguishing the lantern. "Into the hayloft." They climbed the ladder just as riders entered the yard. From a gap in the barn's wall, Tess could see 3 men dismounting. One was Holloway, unmistakable even in the darkness. The others she didn't recognize, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of hired guns. "Check the house and barn," Holloway ordered. "Make sure there's no one squatting. The new owners arrive next week, and I promise them a clean property." Thomas pulled Tess deeper into the shadows of the hayloft. As one of the men entered the barn, lighting a match and looking around. For a heart-stopping moment, Tess thought he would see the disturbed floorboard, but he merely glanced around before calling out. "All clear in here, boss." "Good," Holloway responded. "Let's get back to town. I've got paperwork to finish before the sale is complete." The men mounted and rode away, leaving Tess and Thomas in the darkness of the hayloft, hearts pounding from the close call. "That was too close," Thomas murmured. "We should wait a while before heading back, make sure they're gone." They sat in the darkness, shoulders touching, the tin box secure in Thomas's saddlebag. Tess felt a mixture of fear, hope, and something else, a growing warmth whenever Thomas was near. In the weeks since her arrival in Verde, he had become more than just the man who had offered help on a dark night. He had become a friend, and perhaps something more. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for helping me." "I know what it's like to lose everything," Thomas replied, his voice equally quiet. "My parents died in a fire when I was 16. Abby raised me after that. If not for her, I might have ended up on the wrong side of the law instead of wearing this badge." Tess reached out in the darkness, finding his hand and giving it a gentle squeeze. "Your sister is a remarkable woman. You both are remarkable people." Thomas's hand turned, his fingers interlacing with hers. "So are you, Tess Newbury. Most women would have broken under what you've endured." They stayed like that, hands joined, until they were certain Holloway and his men were gone. Then, carefully, they made their way back to Thomas's horse and rode toward Verde, the precious tin box bumping against Thomas's leg with each stride. Dawn was breaking as they reached town, slipping quietly into the back entrance of Abigail's shop. Thomas built a fire in the kitchen stove while Tess prepared coffee, and Abigail, roused by their return, joined them at the kitchen table as they opened the tin box. Inside were several documents, the deed to the land, letters from the bank, and the loan agreement itself. Thomas read through them carefully, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "This confirms it," he said finally. "The loan was for 3 years, not 18 months. Holloway called it due early, and when your father couldn't pay, he foreclosed illegally." "Can we prove it?" Abigail asked. "Holloway has powerful friends, including Judge Wilson." Thomas nodded grimly. "That's the challenge. We need someone with more authority than a local judge, someone who can't be bought." "The federal marshal," Tess suggested. "Isn't he your superior?" "Marshal Gardner," Thomas confirmed. "He's a good man, fair-minded, but he's based in Omaha, and he only comes through every few months." "When is he due next?" Abigail asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "Actually, he's scheduled to arrive next week. His regular circuit brings him through Verde around the 1st of each month." "That's perfect timing," Tess said excitedly. "Holloway said the new owners are arriving next week, too. If we can show the marshal these papers before the property changes hands again." Thomas nodded slowly, a plan forming. "We'll need to keep this quiet until the marshal arrives. If Holloway suspects we have evidence against him, he might try to accelerate the sale, or worse." The next week was the longest of Tess's life. She continued working in the millinery shop, smiling at customers, and creating beautiful hats while her mind raced with thoughts of her farm and the coming confrontation with Holloway. Thomas kept the documents secure in the marshal's office safe, checking regularly to ensure they remained undisturbed. Marshal James Gardner arrived on Tuesday, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. Thomas briefed him privately, showing him the loan documents and explaining their suspicions about Holloway's practices. "This isn't the first complaint I've heard about Edward Holloway," Gardner said, studying the papers. "But it's the first time I've seen solid evidence. Good work, Deputy." They agreed to confront Holloway the next morning at the bank, just hours before the scheduled arrival of the farm's supposed new owners. That night, unable to sleep, Tess sat by her bedroom window, watching the quiet streets of Verde and praying that tomorrow would bring justice. Morning came with a gentle rain, unusual for September in Nebraska. Tess dressed carefully in her blue dress. pinning her hair neatly and adding the locket containing her mother's hair. If she was to face Holloway and reclaim her family's land, she wanted to look her strongest. Abigail insisted on accompanying them to the bank, stating firmly that Tess shouldn't face this alone. Together, the three of them met Marshal Gardner outside the bank, just as it opened for the day's business. Holloway's face, when they entered, was a study in shifting emotions, surprise at seeing Tess, wariness at the sight of the marshal, and finally, as he spotted the documents in Gardner's hand, a flicker of fear, quickly masked by bluster. "Marshal Gardner," he said, rising from behind his desk. "This is an unexpected pleasure. What can the Bank of Verde do for you today?" "Mr. Holloway," the marshal replied, his voice level but carrying authority that filled the room. "I'm here regarding some irregularities in your handling of the Newbury property." Holloway's smile remained fixed, but his eyes darted to Tess. "I'm afraid I don't understand. Everything was handled according to bank policy and state law." "That's not what these documents indicate," Gardner said, placing the loan agreement on the desk. "This clearly states a 3-year term, yet you foreclosed after 18 months. "There must be some misunderstanding," Holloway began, but Gardner cut him off. "No misunderstanding, Mr. Holloway. I've reviewed the county records as well. This isn't the first time you've called in loans early, is it? Always targeting small farmers who can't fight back. Always resulting in the land being sold to the same group of investors." Holloway's facade began to crumble. "Marshal, surely you understand the complexities of banking. When a debtor shows signs of defaulting—" "Save it for the judge," Gardner interrupted. "I'm placing you under arrest for fraud, Mr. Holloway, and I'll be auditing every loan this bank has issued in the past 5 years. The color drained from Holloway's face as Thomas stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "You can't do this," the banker sputtered. "I have friends in the territorial government." "And I answer to the federal government," Gardner replied calmly. "Your friends won't help you now." As Thomas led Holloway away, the marshal turned to Tess. "Miss Newbury, I'll need your full statement, but I can tell you now that based on these documents, your property will be returned to you. The foreclosure was illegal and will be voided." Tess's knees nearly buckled with relief. Abigail caught her arm, steadying her as tears of joy spilled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Holloway's arrest sent shockwaves through Verde. Other farmers came forward with similar stories, and the bank was temporarily placed under the management of a federal receiver while the investigation continued. The investors who had been scheduled to purchase Tess's farm disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, unwilling to face scrutiny from Marshal Gardner. A week later, Thomas drove Tess out to her farm in a borrowed wagon. The marshal had officially voided the foreclosure and returned the deed to her name. But there was still the matter of her possessions, scattered by the bank's seizure. "Some things can't be recovered," Thomas cautioned as they approached the property, "but the town has come together to help." As they crested the final hill, Tess gasped. Waiting at her farmhouse was a crowd of people townsfolk from Verde, neighboring farmers, even travelers passing through who had heard her story. They had brought furniture, tools, seed for planting, even livestock. Women from the sewing circle had made quilts and curtains. The general store owner had donated provisions to stock her pantry. "We can't replace what was lost," Abigail said, appearing beside the wagon as they pulled up. "But we can help you start again." Tears flowed freely as Tess walked through her home, now furnished with the generosity of neighbors and friends. It wasn't the same as before. Her mother's china could never be replaced, nor her father's handcrafted furniture. But it was a beginning, a new foundation built on the kindness of a community that had embraced her. That evening, after the well-wishers had departed, Thomas lingered, helping Tess settle into her reclaimed home. They sat on the porch as twilight descended, watching as fireflies began to dance across the prairie. "Will you be all right out here alone?" Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. Tess considered the question. "I grew up on a farm. I know how to manage the land, but it won't be easy alone." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking about that, about a lot of things, actually." He turned to face her, taking her hand in his. "Tess, we haven't known each other long, but in these weeks, I've come to admire you more than any woman I've ever met. Your strength, your determination, your kindness. Tess's heart quickened as Thomas continued. I'm not asking for an answer now. It's too soon, and you've been through too much. But I want you to know that if you'd consider it someday, I'd like to court you properly. And perhaps, if you came to feel for me what I already feel for you, we might build a life here, together. His words hung in the evening air, honest and hopeful. Tess looked at their joined hands, then up at Thomas's face, seeing in his eyes the same quality that had first earned her trust that night on the road, steadfast integrity and genuine care. I don't need time to consider, she said softly. You were there for me when I had nothing. You believed me when no one else would. And these past weeks, getting to know you, she took a deep breath. Yes, Thomas, I would welcome your courtship. His smile illuminated his entire face, more radiant than the setting sun. Gently, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a brief, tender first kiss that held the promise of many more to come. As they sat together watching night fall over the Nebraska plains, Tess reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had lost so much: her parents, her home, her possessions. Yet somehow, through that loss, she had found something precious. A community, a purpose, and now, perhaps, a love that could heal her broken heart. What are you thinking? Thomas asked, his arm around her shoulders. Tess leaned into his embrace, a sense of peace settling over her. I'm thinking about what you said that night on the road, about still having tomorrow. And do you believe it now? Yes, she replied, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. I do. Tomorrow, and many more after that. Autumn came to Nebraska, painting the prairie with russet and gold. Tess worked alongside hired hands to bring in what remained of the summer's crops and prepare the fields for winter. The farm would not be profitable this year, but with careful management and the support of neighbors, she would survive until spring brought new opportunities. Thomas rode out whenever his duties permitted, helping with repairs to the barn and house, bringing supplies from town, and courting Tess with a respectful patience that endeared him to her more each day. Sometimes they worked side by side in comfortable silence. Other times they talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. On Sundays, they rode together to church in Verdi, their growing attachment noted with approving smiles by the townsfolk. Edward Holloway had been transferred to Omaha to stand trial, and as Marshal Gardner had promised, the investigation into the bank's practices revealed a pattern of fraud that had victimized dozens of farmers across 3 counties. Other bankers were brought in to restructure loans and provide fair terms to those who had been wronged. As winter approached, bringing with it the threat of isolation at the remote farm, Thomas broached a subject that had been on his mind. The marshal has offered me a promotion, he said one evening as they sat before the fire in Tess's small parlor, to full marshal, responsible for Verdi and the surrounding area. Thomas, that's wonderful, Tess exclaimed. You've earned it. It means more responsibility, he cautioned, more time away from home, riding circuit like Gardner does. But it also means a better salary, a more secure future. He paused, gathering courage. A future I hope to share with you. From his pocket he withdrew a small box, simple and unadorned. Inside lay a ring, not extravagant, but beautiful in its craftsmanship, a small pearl set in silver. Tess Newbury, I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Tears welled in Tess's eyes, but unlike the tears she had shed the night her home was taken, these were born of joy, not sorrow. Yes, she whispered, yes, I will marry you, Thomas Callahan. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and as their lips met, Tess felt the last pieces of her broken heart mending, stronger now at the broken places. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church in Verdi, snow falling gently outside as they spoke their vows before friends and neighbors. Abigail stood as Tess's attendant, beaming with happiness for her brother and the woman who had become like a sister to her. Marshal Gardner, returned from Omaha for the occasion, stood as Thomas's best man. After the ceremony, the entire town celebrated at the hotel, the dining room transformed with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. There was dancing and laughter, gifts and well wishes, a community coming together to celebrate new beginnings. That night, As Thomas carried her across the threshold of the farmhouse, now their home, Tess realized how far she had come from that desperate night when she had walked away with nothing but a bundle of clothes and her father's knife. Now she had a husband who loved her, a community that supported her, and hope for the future that stretched as vast and promising as the Nebraska sky. Winter passed in a haze of newlywed bliss, the isolated farm providing a cocoon where Tess and Thomas learned the rhythms of married life. Thomas maintained his duties as marshal, riding out when necessary, but always returning to the warmth of their home and Tess's embrace. Together, they planned for spring planting, for improvements to the farm, for the life they would build. One crisp March morning, as sunlight streamed through freshly washed curtains, Tess shared news that would change their lives once more. "Thomas," she said, taking his hands in hers as he prepared to leave for town, "there's something I need to tell you." His eyes, always so attentive, focused on her face, noting the mixture of nervousness and joy in her expression. "Come August," she continued, a smile blooming, "we'll need to make room for someone else in this house." Understanding dawned, and Thomas's face transformed with wonder. "A baby? We're having a baby?" Tess nodded, laughing as he lifted her in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen with unrestrained delight. "Put me down, you fool," she giggled, "or I'll be sick all over your badge." He set her gently on her feet, but kept his arms around her, one hand moving to rest reverently on her still flat stomach. "A child," he whispered. "Our child." The news spread quickly through Verdi, met with congratulations and offers of help. Abigail immediately began planning baby clothes, while the women of the sewing circle promised quilts and blankets. Thomas expanded his plans for the farm, adding a nursery to the renovations he had already scheduled. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing with it new life across the prairie. Fields that had lain dormant under snow now burst with tender green shoots. The hired hands Thomas had engaged worked from sunrise to sunset, plowing and planting, repairing fences, and tending to the small herd of cattle they had acquired. Tess, despite her growing condition, insisted on maintaining her role in managing the farm. She kept the accounts, oversaw the household, and even helped with the kitchen garden, though Thomas watched her like a hawk, insisting she rest whenever her face showed the slightest sign of fatigue. "I'm with child, not made of glass," she would scold, but secretly she cherished his concern. By midsummer, the farm was thriving. Crops grew tall and healthy in the fields. The cattle had produced several calves, and the renovated barn housed chickens that provided eggs for both their table and the market in Verdi. The house, once emptied by Holloway's men, now brimmed with life and belongings that, while not the family heirlooms Tess had lost, held their own meaning as the foundation of her new life with Thomas. August arrived with sweltering heat that made Tess's final weeks of pregnancy a trial of patience and discomfort. She waddled rather than walked, her once slim figure now gloriously round, with the child who seemed determined to kick at every opportunity. "He's going to be a marshal like his father," she told Thomas one night as they lay in bed, his hand caressing her belly, as their child performed what felt like acrobatics beneath her skin. "Or she might be a farmer like her mother," Thomas countered with a smile. "Either way, this child will be loved beyond measure." 2 weeks later, as a thunderstorm raged across the prairie, Tess went into labor. Thomas, panic briefly overriding his usual calm, rode through the downpour to fetch both the doctor from Verdi and Abigail, who had been staying nearby in anticipation of this moment. The birth was long and difficult, the summer heat making the ordeal more taxing, but as dawn broke, clearing away both the storm and the night, a lusty cry announced the arrival of William James Callahan, named for both grandfathers he would never meet, but whose legacy would shape his life nonetheless. Thomas, allowed into the bedroom after the doctor had ensured that both mother and child were well, approached the bed with awe. Tess, exhausted but radiant, held their son wrapped in one of the blankets the sewing circle had provided. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he gazed at the tiny, red-faced infant. "Look what we made, Tess." "Would you like to hold your son, Marshal Callahan?" she asked, smiling despite her exhaustion. With trembling hands, Thomas took the small bundle, cradling his son with a tenderness that made Tess's heart swell. In that moment, watching her husband with their child, Tess felt a sense of completion. of coming full circle, from loss to love, from emptiness to abundance. William grew quickly, a strong, healthy baby, with his father's observant eyes and his mother's determined spirit. The farm prospered, and as he learned to crawl and then toddle across the wooden floors of the farmhouse, his parents watched with pride and occasional alarm at his fearless exploration of the world around him. When William was 2, the family expanded again, with the arrival of twins, a boy and a girl named Thomas Jr. and Elizabeth, born in the winter of 1879 during a blizzard that kept the doctor from reaching the farm. Abigail, visiting for the holidays, served as midwife, while Thomas nearly wore a path in the floorboards, pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. Twins, Thomas marveled afterward, a baby in each arm as Tess rested. "How did we get so blessed?" "We earned it," Tess replied softly, remembering all they had overcome to reach this point. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons, marked by harvests and holidays, birthdays and anniversaries. Thomas continued his work as marshal, respected throughout the territory for his fairness and integrity. Tess managed the farm with increasing success, expanding their operations to include a small orchard and additional livestock. In 1882, when William was 5 and the twins were 3, Edward Holloway was released from prison after serving his sentence for fraud. Word reached Verdi that he had boarded a train east, reportedly heading to Chicago to stay with distant relatives. His departure went largely unremarked upon, the wounds he had inflicted on the community having largely healed with time and justice. That same year, Nebraska experienced one of its worst droughts in memory. Crops withered in the fields, streams ran dry, and farmers throughout the territory faced ruin. But the Callahan farm, with its diversified operations and careful management, survived where others failed. Thomas and Tess, remembering their own struggles, extended help to neighbors in need, offering work, food, and in some cases, loans to tide them over until rain returned. "We're doing what Holloway never did," Thomas remarked one evening as they discussed which families most needed assistance. "Using what we have to lift others up rather than profit from their misfortune." Tess nodded, squeezing his hand. "That's the difference between building a community and merely accumulating wealth." In the spring of 1883, as Nebraska celebrated statehood and the drought finally broke with weeks of gentle soaking rain, Tess discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy proved easier than her previous ones, perhaps because at 30, she was stronger and more confident in her body's capabilities. Samuel David Callahan arrived in November, a quiet baby with thoughtful eyes who seemed content to observe his siblings' antics from the safety of his mother's arms. William, now 6 and self-appointed man of the house whenever Thomas was away, took his role as eldest brother seriously, helping with chores and watching over the twins and baby with protective vigilance. As the children grew, so did the farm and the town of Verdi. The railroad came through in 1885, bringing increased prosperity and connection to the wider world. Thomas was elected sheriff, a position that kept him closer to home while maintaining his role in upholding justice. Abigail married a widowed shopkeeper from the neighboring town, expanding her millinery business to include a second location. Through it all, Tess and Thomas remained anchored in their love for each other and the life they had built from the ashes of her loss. Each anniversary, they would sit on the porch of their home, expanded now to accommodate their growing family, and reminisce about that first meeting on a dark road when a deputy marshal had offered hope to a woman who thought she had lost everything. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Tess asked on their 10th anniversary, watching as their children played in the yard, their laughter carried on the summer breeze. "If Holloway hadn't taken my farm, if we hadn't met that night?" Thomas considered the question, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. "I believe we would have found each other somehow," he said finally. "Some things are meant to be, regardless of the path taken to reach them." Tess leaned her head on his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "You were right, you know, that night when you said I still had tomorrow." "I usually am right," Thomas teased, earning a playful swat on his arm. "Don't push your luck, Marshal Callahan," Tess laughed. "But truly, you gave me hope when I needed it most. You helped me see beyond my loss to the possibility of a new beginning." Thomas turned, cupping her face in his hands with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding night. "And you, Tess Callahan," taught me the true meaning of strength. You rebuilt your life from nothing. You showed me that a home isn't just a place or possessions, it's the people we love and who love us in return. As twilight deepened into night, they called the children in for supper, their voices blending in the familiar ritual of family life. Later, after the youngest were tucked into bed and William was allowed to stay up a bit longer with a book, Thomas and Tess stood in the doorway of their home, looking out at the land that had once been taken from them and was now the foundation of their shared happiness. "We've come a long way from that night on the road," Thomas murmured, his arm around Tess's waist. "Yes," she agreed, leaning into his embrace. "And we have many more tomorrows ahead of us." In the years that followed, the Callahan family continued to thrive. William grew into a thoughtful young man who shared his father's sense of justice and eventually followed him into law enforcement. The twins, Thomas Jr. and Elizabeth, displayed complementary talents, he with a gift for working the land, she with a sharp mind for business and accounts. Samuel, the quiet observer, revealed a talent for healing, eventually studying medicine in Omaha before returning to establish a proper doctor's office in Verdi. Tess and Thomas aged gracefully together, their love deepening with each passing season. By the time they celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1906, their once struggling farm had become one of the most prosperous in the county, and their children had given them grandchildren who filled the house with noise and joy during family gatherings. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over land that had witnessed both their struggles and triumphs, Tess took Thomas's weathered hand in hers. "Do you remember what you said to me that night, all those years ago?" she asked, her voice soft with memory. Thomas smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with affection. "I said you still had tomorrow." "And you were right," Tess replied, gazing out at the golden fields that stretched to the horizon. "We had tomorrow, and all the days after that." As twilight settled over the Nebraska prairie, they sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found in each other not just love, but the strength to transform loss into legacy, despair into hope, and a chance encounter on a dark road into a lifetime of tomorrows.